Welcome back to another video in our no-code fundamental pillars series. Now, hopefully you've already had a chance to have a look at our 4 pillars: databases, UI and UX, workflows, APIs and integrations, because in this video we're going to be looking at the knowledge you've gained in those chapters and bringing it together to create a blueprint that you can use to go and build your first real live functioning no-code app. If you haven't already had a chance to look at them, I highly recommend you go do that first, because otherwise the things in this lesson probably won't make a lot of sense and you probably won't get much out of them. But if you're all caught up, then let's jump in. So up till now, we've learned the real basics and the kind of fundamentals that you need to really create no-code apps. Be it databases, be it repeating data lists, the different UI and UX components that are available, how workflows work, logic, etc., etc. Now what we want to do is pull all of that together into a design that you can follow in your favourite no-code tool and start to build out the app that you've been thinking about. Now we're going to do this in 4 key stages. We're going to look at what kind of people will be using your app. We're going to be looking at the various different actions that are going to happen in your app. What are people going to do to get value from it? We're going to choose which kind of data and data relationships you're going to have to set up in your database in order to support those actions. And then once we've kind of figured out those basics, we'll then look at everything that sits around it. What no-code tool are you going to use? How is your UI and UX going to look? What kind of third-party services will you plug into, etc. And just as a kind of quick reminder, now this is something I've talked about from the very first videos, but the reason that it's worth taking the time not only to go through this video, which will probably be one of our longest, but also just to actually sit and draw this on paper, is because if you do it this way, you're probably going to save yourself a lot of rework down the line. First of all, if you're struggling to actually figure out where to get started, if you're opening a no-code tool and that blank canvas puts you off, then having this plan in paper is just essentially going to give you an action plan for the first thing you need to do right through to the 10th, 20th, 30th thing you need to do to get your app built up and running. But probably more importantly, as I've mentioned before, on NoCode.Tech, we've had tons of people who've come through, they've told us, I've been building out this app, it's all singing, all dancing, does all this stuff, been working on it for months, but one thing doesn't work and I don't understand how to do this, or something's not working the way it should be. And 90% of the time when we dive in and we look at it, there's always some fundamental flaw from the beginning. Maybe they didn't think about their database model. Maybe they didn't think about their API and, would it actually do what they wanted it to do, etc. Now, hopefully if you've got this far already, then you've already going to have avoided 80% of those kind of problems. You've got the fundamental knowledge now of where things can go wrong and how you can sort them. But taking that extra step, drawing this out in paper, is just going to help you not only get a better understanding of what you're really trying to build beyond the image in your head, but also just kind of figure out where the challenges are going to be, flesh out a sort of, what it is that you actually have to build out and sort of bring into reality. Because 9 times out of 10, it's either going to be a lot less than you think, or it's going to be a lot more than you think. It's very rarely, true that people are building exactly what they imagined. There's always going to be a complexity. There's always going to be a challenge, and this process is just designed to flush that out and help you solve it on paper with a pen or a pencil and an eraser before you go and spend all this time building something in a no-code tool, and then you've got to throw it away because actually something went wrong. So to do this, I present to you the no-code canvas. Now, there'll be a few links in the description below around about where you can find a link to this canvas. As you can see, it is a bunch of boxes on a piece of paper, so you could equally grab your notebook, draw it out. The sizes don't 100% matter as long as they're kind of proportional. It's a simple canvas. So let me talk to you a little bit more about what you're actually looking at. So the no-code canvas has been especially designed to help you quickly fit a broad overview of your app onto a single piece of paper. And that, by the way, is a really important point. This is all about not creating a 20-page design document, down to the nth degree. It's just about having one single simple place that you can, at a glance, see what your app is meant to do and get started. You might have seen this concept of a kind of business canvas before, a lean canvas, an MVP canvas. by no means did I come up with this concept. I've only just customized a very popular business strategy concept and turned that into what I would call the no-code app building canvas. So you can either use this on your computer via a tool called Whimsical, and I've got a link in the description or on the slides if you're following along, right where it says click here. If not, you can also, as I say, you can print it out, draw it out, use a different tool if it works for you. But I've got an example video right after this one of me actually filling the canvas out, and I've done that on Whimsical. Now, one of the things I will just say, clearly this canvas to my mind is going to be incredibly helpful. I think it's going to add a lot to you, but it's also it's not going to be for everybody. If you're quite a visual person, especially if you're a designer or something like that, and you're very comfortable, for example, sketching out things, do whatever feels best for you. Hopefully the canvas helps you, but if you do want to just kind of draw something out, that's okay. This is just one method of bringing it all together. And even if you don't follow the canvas, I think it's worth paying attention to each of the headings that we've got here in the canvas, and I'll kind of talk about them as we go through. But it's worth paying attention to them even if you're not filling this out, because to my mind they kind of cover all of the main things you need to think about when actually saying, okay, it's time to build a no-code app. So as I said, this is not intended to be an exhaustive design. It is just a quick way to get it sketched up and get you ready to start building. So, this should not be 20 pages long. So the way that we start this is always in the top left-hand corner where we've got our problem statement. And as I've said, throughout this video, I'm just going to talk you through the points. If you actually want to watch me fill it out and see a lot more examples, watch the video straight after this one. But let's start in the top left-hand corner. And really what you want to do there is think about the problem statement. You can almost call it the elevator pitch, but what is your app going to do? How do you succinctly sum that up or capture that value? Is it an app to connect car owners with car washers? Is it an app to help banks count their money, for example? Whatever it is that your app does, you should just nail it up there on the left, just because it's going to be something that we refer back to time and time again as we go through the canvas to make sure that that what we are building and what we are thinking about building actually ties to what you are trying to achieve. If you're writing that you are creating an online store to source great dog treats, then we want to make sure that we are, as we go through and we start looking at personas, we start looking at data and data relationships, we're thinking about, okay, well, where are those dog treats going, who's buying them, all this kind of thing. So problem statement, not a huge amount else to say on that, but write that top left and really put as much or as little detail in there as you like. And again, if you want to see me doing it, watch the other video. So with problem statement out the way, that was a really easy bit. Now we're going to get into the slightly harder bit, and the first one, the first kind of block that we're going to talk about is personas. And the way that I think about personas is it's essentially who is using your app. Is it one type of person? Is it multiple people? And now for most apps, you are probably just going to have one type of person, and it's this idea that anybody who logs in gets the same experience. I would typically call that group of people a user. So if you've got like a to-do list app, or let's say you had a calculator app, something very, very simple, you're almost always only going to have one group of people, and it's going to be called users. However, if you had something more complex, let's say you had an app like Postmates, Just Eat, Deliveroo, something where you have customers who log on, they order food from a restaurant, and then somebody delivers that food to them. Well, that's going to have a lot more complex personas, because immediately, the customers need to use the app, but we also have the restaurants who need to use the app, the restaurant owners, the restaurant staff, and then we also need to have delivery drivers who use the app as well. So immediately for one app, we've got 3 different personas, and actually, the value that each of those people get out of the app is different. For a restaurant, they want as many orders as possible. For a customer, they want as much selection as possible, and they want their food to get there as quickly as possible. For a delivery driver, they want to, I imagine, make as much money as possible, which means they probably want, yes, to have as many orders as possible, but they want to also travel the least amount of distance possible. You know, they would rather do lots of short trips between restaurants and customers rather than one big trip from one side of the town to the other, because that way they're going to do more orders, they're going to make more money. So, you know, that's just an example of how in depth you can get with this thinking. You don't necessarily need to go that far, and we'll talk about on the next slide exactly what kind of information you should enter. But it's kind of how you should be thinking about your personas. You know, who are the different groups? What is the value that they're trying to get? And by the way, that is something you can capture on the problem statement as well. You know, if there are multiple people using your app who get very different pieces of value or different results from it, then it is absolutely worth capturing that in your problem statement. A couple of other little things to point out here as well. If you're struggling to figure out, well, do I have one group of users? Do I not? There's a couple of things you can do to try and I guess straighten that out in your head. The first thing to sort of say is, you know, is there something in your app that one user can do but another user cannot? You know, is there a certain screen or a certain action that one type of user can see but another can't? You know, is there like a secret bit you can unlock, or is there a kind of a user with more privileges? If there is, then the chances are those are different personas. You know, they could be different people using the app. Another way to think about it is the data that you store about one user significantly different to the other? For example, you know, if I look at my customers, you know, drivers, etc., example from earlier, that's really obvious, right? Because for customers, I need to store their order history. You know, what food did they order? What card details do they have, etc. Whereas with a delivery driver, you know, I'm going to record probably their vehicle. I'm going to record, you know, their general location, so I know which restaurants to send to them. I'm going to record, you know, which customers they've been to visit, you know, that sort of thing. So if you feel that you've got to save very different types of data for other people, that's another kind of rule of thumb. And then finally, another thing to think about is if you need an administrative user or a privileged user, as we would sometimes call them, i.e., you know, is there somebody who can kind of come in and do things that other people can't, almost in a kind of staff capacity. So if you imagine, for example, a moderator of a forum who is able to come in, you know, ban people from the forum, edit discussions, you know, that kind of thing, to me, that's most likely going to be a different group of users. Not always the case, but I'd probably consider that a different persona. Now, as much as we're talking about personas, persona for me is a very researchy type term. It's very broad, it's very kind of touchy-feely. It's very much about not only who is this person, but what do they care about, what do they think about. However, when we talk about users throughout, or different people going to be using your app throughout this, we're primarily talking about it from a data point of view. And so we're going to use the phrase user groups as a generic way to refer to anybody. So if you've got drivers, if you've got, I don't know, doctors, if you've got hairdressers, you know, whatever it might be, customers, users, whatever you're calling it, we will refer to them as a group of users, or in short, a user group. So in terms of actually, you know, getting that in the canvas and doing something with it, so, you know, I think the best thing to do in my head is to write down, you know, what is the user group's name? So is it drivers? You know, is it postmen or postwomen? Is it you know, is it customers, something more generic? And you kind of, you know, you need to kind of write a few things that are going to capture what makes the group different from another group. So for example, you know, what is each group's specific goals and outcomes for your app? Take the restaurant example from earlier. You know, a customer, they probably have 2 or 3 key things. Number 1, they want to order food. Number 2, they want to find food. And number 3, they probably want to check where their food is. But there's then going to be another group who face off to them, for example, called a delivery driver, who care about what orders are coming through and where those orders need to go. That's probably it. So it's just a way to kind of figure out what are the 2 or 3 pieces of value that this user group's going to get. Write them down. They're really key, really important. And I'll give you another example, by the way, because I covered it in my second video, which is Airbnb, because we've talked about that a lot. Well, you know, if we've got a group of visitors or tourists, then they are going to, you know, they're going to want to browse and search apartments, book an apartment, leave a review. You know, it's those kind of really key actions. The other thing you want to consider is, are they using your app on mobile, web, or another platform? So for example, if I am a restaurant and I've got a delivery app again, the good chance I'm going to want to use that on web because I'm probably going to have a computer. I might have a tablet as well. If I am a delivery driver, I almost certainly want to use the mobile app. That is almost essential because, well, how many delivery drivers do you know who are driving around with a laptop in their car to see where they're going? And then obviously if I'm a customer, well, I might use both. I might be ordering on my laptop, I might be ordering on mobile. It's just a good thing to write down because it's going to influence a couple of things. Number one, do you need more than one platform? And if so, what kind of tools, etc., are going to support that? But also number two, do you need a different app? Like, can a delivery driver use the same app as a customer? Is that going to work? Do you need two? Lots of things to think about there. And then the last one, and this is a little bit subjective, but I think it's worth you considering the experience that they expect. You don't need to go into a huge amount of detail here, and whether you do this on a computer and whimsical versus writing it in paper, i.e. how much space have you got to write is probably going to dictate that. But it's worth just considering sort of what somebody is going to expect. So take a customer for a restaurant app, as we keep talking about. They probably care about finding as many options as possible. They probably care about having really, really good pictures. But a driver using the app, on the other hand, they care about something slightly different. They probably care about getting in the app very, very quickly. They care about having sat-nav that works very well. They probably care about having as much information about the customer's address as possible. So, what's the buzzer number? What's the password? Something like that. And so, you could write down like a couple of words, or you could easily write paragraphs and paragraphs about that. But all we're trying to do is just influence a little bit, what really matters to these people, and as a result, how is that going to affect the specific goals and outcomes that we're going to build for them. And if you're struggling with figuring out the exact amount to write down, don't worry about that. Clearly the point of the canvas is to be small enough to limit you so that you're not writing too much. It should be a little. But as you start to see the rest of the canvas and what we're thinking about, I think it will make a little bit more sense to you. So now that we've kind of tackled who is actually using your app, who the different users are, we're going to talk about core and secondary functionality. And this is probably the kind of most important bit that everybody thinks about. So core functionality refers to the absolute essential, few things that your app can do, typically between 1 and 5. I like to aim around about 3, but what are the absolutely core things that your app does? So for example, if you had an app, if you were building Uber, a taxi delivery service, then the absolute core piece of functionality is the ability to call a taxi, get on the app, hit a button, and a taxi appears. Similarly, if you were building Twitter, then the absolute core piece of functionality there is to be able to send a tweet. But you also have some other core pieces of functionality, like being able to read a tweet and be able to follow somebody. So it's just about thinking, what are the absolute key things? If you've got as many as 5, I'm slightly worried at that point. There's a good chance that you're starting to kind of walk into secondary functionality secondary functionality territory. That's a hard thing to say, by the way. So yeah, if you're kind of doing as much as 5, there's a good chance that you've gone a little bit too far. Usually 3 is a sweet spot, and if your app is really simple, then it should just be one key thing. But to then go into secondary functionality, got it right that time, this starts to refer to everything that you kind of need to make your app work, but is not the core value. So for example, Facebook and Twitter, Uber, all these services need you to log in, but none of them go around saying, Facebook is a service for logging in and posting. They just say Facebook is a service for posting or finding friends or whatever it might be. And so, secondary functionality is really just what are some of the key things that you need to make your app work? So you probably need a sign up, you probably need a login, you might need some sort of onboarding screen for getting the user's information. If you're Uber, then you might need ride history or the ability to add payments, these kind of things where it's not the core things your users are going to talk about or feel value from, but they are the things that you need to actually make your app happen. And it's important, not to get too carried away there, because you can easily write out 110 different things. I would think more about, if this is my core functionality, what are the key things that I have to go around that in order to allow the user to do core functionality? So not extra features, but like if they're going to tweet, they need to be able to log in. If they're going to order a taxi, they need to be able to pay for the taxi. So how is all that happening? That's what you want to think about in terms of secondary functionality. Now, in terms of how we get this on the canvas, a couple of things, I think first of all, this kind of model of thinking is not going to be applicable for every little thing that your app can do. It is kind of hard to break everything into core functionality and secondary functionality, but in particular around the core parts, this is where it's most important. So start by just kind of thinking about the core 2 or 3 actions of your app. As I said, you can probably have up to 5. I mean, there's no real limit, I'm just making up a limit. But 2 to 3 to me is what tends to feel right, and it's really important to avoid what we call scope creep, which is when you have one little idea and then suddenly you've got to add 100 things in and get it just right. And in terms of what your kind of core actions or core functionality it could be, this could be just like, it could be showing specific data. So the fact that you can scroll, for example, a feed on Twitter, that is core functionality, even if the user isn't putting something in or creating something there. Similarly, the ability to just search for an apartment on Airbnb is core functionality. So, it could be showing specific data. If you go on a banking app, it could be just showing your balance. It could be creating new data. It's not just about interaction. And the other thing that I would kind of suggest is kind of try to visualize how somebody would use your app. Okay, they log in, so they go there, they click here, what do they do next, what information do they have to fill in, kind of following that through, thinking about what the user does, and almost trying to visualize the front end through to the back end. And we'll talk a bit more later on about how to kind of write that out in more detail. But if you are struggling, then a good thing to do is just think, okay, well, the user clicks something, as a result this creates data. Okay, it's just a good way to try and figure that out. And absolutely start with your core functionality, but once you've done that, you can start to think about the secondary functionality. You can start to say, okay, well, I know how they tweet, how do they log in? If they do log in, do I need to ask them any questions? So on, so forth. And as I sort of touched on in the last slide, you will be pretty surprised at the sort of depth you can go to. One of the things that I think often surprises people is, and actually if you've ever worked in software before or worked in some sort of kind of project management, particularly in software, it is so easy to go, for something to take longer than you think, to kind of go over your timeline. Because when you say, okay, I want to have a sign-up functionality, most people will go, okay, so I need a box for the email address, a box for the password, a button to sign up, and I'll add them to the database, done. But that's not strictly true, because actually you need to think about, well, how am I going to validate the email address to make sure it looks correct? Does my no-code tool do that? Do I have to implement that myself? How am I going to do forgotten password? Okay, well, if I'm doing forgotten password, I need security questions. Where am I storing those? Because I'm sending an email because I've forgotten a password. How am I sending an email? And suddenly this is how functionality can spiral out of control. And so, you're going to have to accept that happens for stuff, especially like sign up. It's pretty essential. You have to have something for a forgotten password. But as you can imagine, the more features and the more core functionality or secondary functionality that you add to your app, the more things you're going to find when you go in and start building them. Actually, something you thought would take you a day is going to take you 10 days, or it's going to take you 2 days, so on and so forth. So it's kind of why I'm saying, try not to go too crazy with it, because the more you write down, the more you're going to have to build. And one of the things I said earlier is you can't have a sign up without a forgotten password, but that's not really true. You can do that, because in the early days when you've only got 10, 20 users, maybe a couple of hundred, it's going to be very rare for somebody to forget their password. You could just manually solve that for them through customer support, and then when it starts to become a problem, you could go build it yourself. So, you can really, when you have that mentality of, oh crap, I don't even need a forgotten password at the start, it's a good way of kind of framing this idea that you don't need to do everything at once. Don't boil the ocean. So that's just what I've kind of covered there. Don't go too far. Yeah, probably a bit of a rule of thumb there. If this exercise is taking you more than 45 minutes to an hour, you've probably gone too far. I think an hour is a perfect amount of time. Anything longer than an hour, you've probably either went into too much detail, or going through the canvas and putting your ideas down in paper has actually made you pause and go, oh, I need to think something out a little bit more. And if you do, that's brilliant. But if you are just, if it's over an hour because you're scribbling down too much, well, you've done too much. It's always going to be hard to kind of figure out and get perfect. It's going to be different for every app. If you get some massive complicated app, then okay, it could take you longer than an hour. But again, I'm just trying to give you some general rule of thumbs, because I know figuring out exactly what level of detail to go to is something that's really difficult, and something that almost takes programmers, years to develop. And I'm not that good at it either. So far we've talked about personas, user groups, we've talked about functionality. Let's now talk about data structure. Now this can really make or break your app. Obviously I talked about earlier this idea that a lot of people should write this down in paper, because they dive in, they break something, and then another month down the road their app doesn't work as expected. Well, the main place that this goes wrong is the data. If you mess your data up, it's going to make it really hard to make new features in the future. You're going to be left with a lot of problems where you've got to manually move user data around, all this this kind of thing. It's not a great experience, essentially. So we've already talked about personas and user groups, and that is one type of data. If you ended up with, for example, a delivery app, and you had customers, restaurant owners, and delivery drivers, then you have to go make 3 database tables, most likely. You've got a customers table, delivery driver table, so on and so forth. So we've already got those user groups covered. But clearly there's going to be a lot of other data in most apps that we've got to think about. So if we had that restaurant, well, we're also going to have to store all of the deliveries, and we're going to have to store all of the restaurant menus, and we're probably going to have to store a bunch of other things. Like, it could be food safety ratings, it could be special offers, could be all sorts of different stuff. So what we want to think about next is what I call generic data. And that's a pretty crap phrase for it, because it's not that generic. I don't think it's the best phrase. But it's thinking about, if you've got those user groups already, what are the things that interact with? What are the other pieces of data that you're going to need to store? If you've got Uber and you've already got riders and drivers, then you're probably going to have to store trips. You're going to probably store vehicles. You'll probably store payment information. And so it's just about writing down what are those kind of really key bits of generic data that you'll probably need another data table for on your database. That's what we want to write down. And I've just added some examples here, really, I guess you could say. It's really going to depend on your app, but orders, apartments, listings, posts, articles, menus, these are all examples of things which somebody does not log into. A user does not log into a menu. They log into a user account, they log into a delivery driver account, but they don't log into a menu, but we still got to store it. That is the way to think about generic data. One thing to say here, you don't really, unless you really want to, and especially if you've only got a couple of database tables, you don't really need to think about every single individual little piece of data. Yes, if you're storing apartments, it's probably good to know that you want to store photos and you want to store a description. But all of the individual data fields tend to add up a bit, and it's something that can be quite hard to figure out until you're either writing out the scenarios in detail, which we'll talk about later, or you're actually building it in your no-code app. So don't stress, don't sit there trying to figure out, okay, I need this, I need this, I need this, because we can tackle that later. As long as you know what kind of broad pieces of data you've got, and if you at least know in your head kind of roughly what's going in there, you'll be fine. So with that covered, let's move on. And again, if it's getting tricky, just watch the other video where I talk through all of this, actually with the canvas in front of me in detail. But now that we've kind of figured out that generic data and user group data, the way I kind of characterise that is all of the people logging into your app, the user groups, they're going to do something, they're going to use that data. Well, now it's time to talk about the different relationships, how these things all fit together. Now, this is going to feel really, really similar to the pillar around databases where we talked about relationships before. If you remember at the time, clearly we talked about one-to-many relationships and many-to-many, but I actually took you through a good way of kind of spelling these out as inspired by that Adalo screen. And I sort of said, the best way to think about it is to kind of think about, saying it out loud. So if you've got one data group called customers and one called orders, a customer can have multiple orders, but an order can only have one customer. Does that sound right? As we've got down here, a user can only have one order, but an order can belong to multiple users. Does that sound right? Probably not. A user can have multiple orders, and an order can belong to multiple users. It doesn't quite sound right either. So a good thing to do here is take your user group, and for each user group and for each piece of generic data, go through and just ask yourself these 3 questions, A, B, and C here out loud. So let's say we have got, apartments and hosts, a bit like our Airbnb example. A good thing to do is just go through these, where it says user, plug in host, where it says order, plug in apartment, and just think about it. So, okay, so a host can have multiple apartments, that sounds right, but an apartment belongs to only one host. Okay, I like the sound of that. That sounds like the right relationship. Let's check the others. A host can only have one apartment, but an apartment can belong to multiple hosts. Well, that doesn't sound right, because why can I only have one apartment, and why would my apartment belong to multiple people? And then a host can have multiple apartments, and an apartment can belong to multiple hosts. Now that sounds partly correct, because I as a host can have multiple apartments, but again, my apartment can only belong to one person. So it's just a way to kind of say these out loud. Now, depending on whether you're doing it in paper, whether you're doing it in whimsical, etc., you might want to do different things. Maybe you want to draw some coloured lines between each of your data groups and your generic data, so that you can figure out which ones belong to which. Maybe you want to actually write it out, so you might want to write out a user can have multiple orders, but an order belongs to only one user. There's a few ways that you can do it and that you can think about it, but when we're talking about databases and how important they are, those database relationships are probably the most important component of your data structure. So it's worth just taking the time to think about it, to write it out. And again, what you'll start to see happens here is, even though you're focused on the data right now, it's going to get you thinking about the functionality. It's going to get you thinking about the screens. This is really where you go from, if you imagine you're an architect, this is where you go from having an idea in your head for a house to actually drawing out the floor plan and thinking about where the doors are and thinking about where the windows are. This is where we really bring it to life. So even if this is really clear in your head, writing it down is going to help you figure out the little bits that you can't quite see in that mental image. And one of the biggest things about software creation is it is so abstract. You have to hold so much information in your head and think about how it all relates to each other. Even for the most hardcore programmers, it is really difficult. Every single time I build something, and I've been programming now for way over 10 years, every single time I build something, I have to draw it out or it just does not compute. So like I say, it can get confusing, it can get a little bit kind of overwhelming, but that's what to do. And so what should really happen is, once we've got our relationships, at this point on our table, or our canvas, we're going to have our problem statement, we've got our personas, we've got our core functionality, we've got our generic data, and we've got our relationships, and hopefully we've also got some or all of our secondary functionality. At this point, you're probably going to feel very far on from where you were at the start of this video. That is a lot of information we've written down. It's a lot of different stuff, and really already it is enough to get started. But we're going to talk about a couple of other elements that we've got on the canvas. Now, the first one is APIs, or third-party services. So, now that we've kind of got that really big, broad understanding of the functionality of the data, it's now kind of time to think about where you might want to access third-party APIs that make your app work. And if you're kind of immediately thinking, I don't need any, some kind of examples to give you, if you want to take payments, you're going to need an API for that, or an integration if it's already built into the NoCode tool. So you're probably going to use Stripe.com. You might use something else, but Stripe.com is a really popular one. You know, if you want to send text messages, you're probably going to use Twilio. If you want to send emails, you might use something like SendGrid. Now, I know you don't know the name to all these APIs I'm listing off. You can find that on the NoCode.Tech website, and you'll also just find it by Googling things like API for sending text messages or API for looking up furniture prices. But this is the time to really think about what third-party services you're going to need. And for each kind of API you think you need, I recommend just marking it down on a canvas, almost as a bit of a, I need to go research this later kind of note. And then it's worth kind of thinking about, if you have picked an API, you know, first of all, how are you going to use it? Is it on Zapier? If not, is it on Zapier competitors like Integromat or N8N.io? If not, have you had a look at the API documentation? Are you feeling confident that you're going to be able to access that, that you're going to be able to use it? And if not, feel free to come and ask for help. But probably the most key thing that you can check is, does the API do what you need it to do? You know, as we talked about before, even though you can go on, say, Facebook and see all the information related to your account, that doesn't necessarily mean Facebook's API is going to let you see it all. Or it might mean that there's some sort of restrictions, like maybe the API can't show images, or maybe it can't show images bigger than a certain, you know, size, etc. So depending on your use case, it can be quite important to just double check the API does everything you want it to do. And if you're using an API to capture a lot of information, or your API is going to be tied into your core functionality. So for example, you know, if you're building something like Airbnb and you're using an API to pull in, you know, Google Maps, or to pull in photos of apartments, or using some sort of search API to do a really powerful search, it's worth just checking how much does that cost, how many times can you use that API before you get locked out for using it too much. Just because you don't want to go and build this really cool app, then connect to your API, put it live, and it doesn't work. So it's a really good example of something just worth writing down and exploring. And actually, the other interesting thing you can do here is, especially if you're new to no code and APIs in general, you will be very surprised at how many APIs are out there for absolutely everything. I mean, there really isn't, like, you get APIs, for example, which will tell you the basic dimensions of most types of furniture, or most consumer products. I mean, there will be APIs out there that will let you query the size of toilet roll, or the size of I don't know, a plunger. I'm going for a bathroom theme here. So there really are APIs for absolutely everything, and you might find that some of the things that you want to build in your app, you could do quicker by going out and researching if there's an API to do it. You know, is there an API to make a calculation, to get some information, to display something, you know, whatever it might be. So again, we're just trying to save you work in the future, you know. Now, at this point, we kind of move on to screens and pages. Clearly, screens and pages is quite a personal thing. I've given you a very small box on the canvas, and so as you might have noticed, I clearly don't expect you to draw your app in there. If we think about screens and pages, you know, screens being the what a user sees on a mobile app, pages being what a user sees on a web app. It's a good idea just to almost think about them in terms of core functionality. So in the same way that we know, okay, a user's got to do this action, this other key action, this other action, what are the screens that they need to utilise that core functionality? What are the screens they need to follow? So you can do a few things. You know, I think the best thing to do is just write them down. So if I was doing Twitter, I'm going to say, okay, number one, I need the timeline page. Number two, I need the profile page. And number three, you know, I need the who to follow page, for example. Or if I'm doing Airbnb, then I'm going to write down, okay, I need a page for searching bookings. I need a page for taking bookings, and I need a page for reviews and, you know, looking at the general detail of an apartment, description, etc. So, you know, again, try and stick to between probably 1 and 5. Just try and list down the different screens that you need. In terms of drawing them out, you know, if you're doing this in paper, you can turn it around and draw it out there. If you're using Whimsical, you could try kind of creating what we call a wireframe, which is when you don't, you know, draw a beautiful picture with all the colours, but you kind of sketch out, okay, this is kind of, you know, there'll be this box here, and there'll be this image on top of it, and this box, you know. So you can do that in a wireframing tool, is what we call it. And we call it a wireframe just because it's like, okay, I've drawn the boundaries, but I've not filled it in with colour and all that kind of thing. So you can use a wireframing tool like Ninja Mock, I quite like. Whimsical is another, and you might already be using Whimsical for the canvas. But this is broadly just when it's a good idea to turn your paper around and draw out the screens. Okay, I've got a screen, and on that I've got a box with the timeline on it, or I've got a search box, whatever it might be. Don't worry about having amazing drawing skills. Mine are absolutely dreadful. In fact, I'll try and show you just exactly how I draw interfaces out here. Here is an example of a page I'm building on the NoCode website. As you can see, I am not an artist. I know you can't see all of that, but hopefully you can see enough of it to tell that essentially I've just drawn a bunch of boxes with no straight lines. My writing is illegible, but you know what? That gives me enough of a structure to get started on a page. Again, it's so hard to start with a blank canvas and go from this amazing idea in your head to, boom, done, there it is. So anything you can draw out, even if it's just some really, really primitive, rudimentary boxes, anything you can draw out in the back of the page is probably going to help you get started. But ultimately, at the very least, we just want to make sure we've at least listed out the main screens that we need. In the same way, we want to understand, okay, we need these 3 functions. We kind of also need to understand, okay, the user's going to see these 4 pages or 5 pages. So, now I've got that, I've kind of saved the most in-depth part for last. I know we've missed out tools, by the way, we'll come back to that in a minute, but I've saved the kind of most in-depth part for last in my head. So, we've got the broad strokes already, we've got the APIs, we've got the databases, the users, you've really got everything you need. But what we kind of don't have, okay, you might have something that says user needs to be able to tweet, but what you don't have is something that kind of lays out the exact process. If we think about our kind of introduction to app building we looked at earlier, this idea that we have a front end, the user does something in the front end, that comes through to the back end, any integrations are triggered, and then something happens in the database. This is where we want to kind of write this out, and just really, if everything we've drawn out so far is the equivalent of a floor plan, for example, in architecture, if it is kind of, here's what we're trying to do, then what we're going to do with scenarios is actually write out the plan of action. So, okay, there's what the floor plan looks like. Step 1, let's go get some bricks for the walls. Step 2, let's put the glass in for the windows, so on and so forth. So I kind of talk about this concept of scenarios. My personal recommendation, we'll come to what scenario exactly is in a minute. My personal recommendation is you map out a scenario for each one of your core functionalities, and then perhaps for 2 or 3 of your more kind of important pieces of secondary functionality. 5 to 8 in my head is enough to get yourself started, and you can almost think of a scenario as a bit of a to-do list, but any more than 5 to 8, again, you might be starting to go a little bit overkill. It depends entirely on your app, but you could be going overkill. So let's kind of talk about what a scenario actually is. It is a visual representation of your user interacting with the interface to achieve a goal. And when I say visual representation, I really mean a written representation. You could draw it out, you could draw it in boxes, you can write it out, it just depends what you're comfortable with. But essentially what we're just trying to do is show the steps that say a user interacts with something, after that a workflow is triggered. Because of that workflow, something happens, data is created or data is shown, whatever it might be, but ultimately something happens in the app. And very, very typically that will follow the model of somebody touches something, a workflow is executed, and then data is either created or changed as a result. 80-90% of apps, completely a stat, I've pulled out my ass, so to speak, but 80 to 90% of apps will follow this model. It is very rare for them not to. In the same way we talked about CRUD methodology earlier, and about how common it is, this same kind of, touch something, some kind of back-end interaction happens, and then data is created or changed. It's really, really, really common. So you can kind of be, there's almost enough information on this previous slide to tell you how to do that. Write down what does the user interact with, then write out what workflow happens. Okay, so the user clicks a button, we take that information, we email it, and then we save something to the database. There's enough information there to kind of understand what a scenario is. But I wanted to just show you, the personal method that I use. You can call this the WAD method or the WAD method, but essentially it's an abbreviation, and here is what it stands for, and I know it's very clever. So I kind of think about it a little bit like, okay, so first of all, who is using this? So in this scenario, who are we expecting to almost kind of trigger that scenario? You know, is it our delivery driver? Is it our restaurant owner? Is it a customer? Is it an owner? Which user group is it? And then what is the user trying to achieve? You know, so are they trying to upload an apartment? You know, are they trying to place an order? Are they trying to, I don't know, make a payment? You know, whatever it might be, whatever your core functionality is, who's trying to do it and what they're trying to do. And then the next thing we want to think about is, when does this scenario happen? So if we know who it is and what they're doing, well, how do we know they've started doing it? You know, have they clicked the button that says upload an apartment? You know, have they entered in their payment information and hit a button that says make payment? You know, have they selected a car and hit, you know, checkout? How do we know what happens? And it could be something being clicked. It could be a time of day. It could be an integration or some sort of trigger. If you think back to all the triggers we talked about in the workflows lesson, this is very similar. And then what we want to think about is, okay, so that's happened. The user's clicked the button, the schedule is activated, the trigger's activated. What should actually happen? What action should take place? And you can be as detailed as you like here, but you can say things like, you know, first of all, immediately just something saved to the database. It could be as simple as that. There's no real action. There's no real middle step. We just go straight to database. But you could say something like, we send an email. Or, you know, the user places an order, and so we calculate the stock levels. Or we double check if their address is within reach. You know, there's a bunch of different stuff that you could do here. It's essentially the workflow part. What happens, you know, the user has you know, caused an action. What is the reaction to it? What action are we as the app executing? Typically, if you're going to do something on API, this is where it will happen. So if you're going to go, I don't know, let's say you're going to go and check a stocks API to get a stock price, or you're going to go to the Facebook API to grab a list of friends. Typically, this is where that would happen. But then what almost always happens after any action is something happens to the database. So we want to consider what data should change. You know, should something be saved to the user's profile? Have they just uploaded a photo? We've checked the photo's an okay size. We've checked it's not, you know, a nude body or something like that we don't want. And we're going to go ahead and upload it. So we're going to save that to the user's profile on the user's database. That's what you need to be thinking about. You know, should something be added to the user database? You know, should a piece of generic data be updated? You can be completely specific. You know, you might say, okay, so with Airbnb, when we upload an apartment, we're going to have an apartment description, you know, between 1 and 30 photos, we're going to have a rating, we're going to have an address, etc. So, and that's kind of thing with these scenarios in general, right? You can be as specific or as non-specific as you like, but what I want is that you can, you know, you can sit with your notebook here, you can sit with your canvas, you can go into a no-code tool, you get the big blank canvas in front of you and you go, okay, what is the first thing I have to do? Scenario, okay, so on the user group, right, I need to go and create that. Okay, they need to click this button. Okay, I better go and get the button on the screen, you know, so on and so forth. The idea is this becomes an action plan, so you can write it out however makes you comfortable. And if you watch the other video where I'm doing this live, then you'll see how I write it out. But I think the WAD method or the WAD method is just a good way of kind of thinking about it. You know, who, what, when, action, data. And then, you know, just to try and kind of bring out the importance of this a bit more, and you know, in some ways, yeah, we're trying to get that action plan, but we're also trying to join up the thinking. You know, you've looked at databases separately from UI and UX, separately from workflows, separately from APIs. What I really want you to do is think about the exact step through. How does the action in the front end lead all the way through your app to get to the back end, to the database, etc. You know, where are you using the key pillars? Because I think as you start to think about these interactions, you're probably going to start to see where there might be something missing. So, okay, yep, you want a user to upload an apartment, but where do they do that? Because you've not got a screen for that yet, so do you need to make a screen for that? Or actually, do you not want to make a screen, so you might move it into the host profile? You know, these are the kind of decisions you want to be trying to encourage to happen in your head. You want to be sort of trying to just write these out, not only so you can then follow that as a blueprint, but so that you can just uncover where you're missing little steps. Because you know, the thing that I personally find, one of the hardest things about building software is when I build something on a no-code tool, or even with normal code, and I go to build the next thing and I've only half thought it out, and so I start to procrastinate because I go, well, I don't really know how I want this screen to look yet, so I kind of need to go away and do something else now and think about it and let me churn that problem over in my head. The more you do this in paper, the more you're doing that thinking up front, and it means you're not going to dive into no code tools, start building something and then stop because you've got to go think about it again, you've got to come back, go think about it. So it's just a good way of almost solidifying your thinking, is the way that I would put it. And then I think just the other benefit as well is, we're talking about getting things right. Well, the best way to do that is to write this out, because then you quickly realise, okay, my apartment needed 30 photos on it, or my restaurant menu needed up to 50 items. Have I got that available in my database? Have I made room for that in my database tables? These are all the things you can start to think about and bring out. So there's one last thing, actually there's two last things I think, but there's one last thing I wanted to cover, which is not actually on the canvas. It's more to do with scenarios. So repeating data lists, you'll hopefully remember these from our UI and UX pillar, and they're a really, really good thing to think about when you're writing out scenarios. When I've talked to people about repeating data lists and this kind of idea of scenarios before, people are often unsure about whether or not a repeating data list, what is that? Is it just a UI and UX element? Actually, is it a workflow? Is it data? It's kind of all of them merged together. So I just wanted to talk about it a little bit. So as I say, there's nothing on the canvas for this specifically. I think it more fits within scenarios. And what we're not talking about here is necessarily the design of that repeating data list. That's up to you to wireframe or draw out however you like. Clearly in this canvas, we're talking less about the visuals and more about the things you need to build, the functionality, how it all fits together. So with that in mind, what I'm trying to talk about with repeating data lists is not, okay, draw it out and see how it looks. It's more about what data do you need to display, and as a result, what database tables do you need to support that, what data structure do you need, how are you going to filter it, all that kind of thing. So the best thing to do is just think about, where do you need to display data. Now I don't mean, okay, it says hello now when I log in, or it's showing a bank balance. I mean, when do you have a serious amount of data to display? It could be search results, it could be product listings, it could be a map with lots of different people on it, whatever it is. Maybe you've got I've given one of the examples here that I think is a good one as well, is just a feed or a timeline of social posts. Anytime you've got a bunch of data, that's what I want you to think about. And so what we just want to do is figure those sources out, and then we want to consider four things in our scenario. Number one, what database table are we going to pull the data from? So okay, you've got a big repeating data list full of menu items, so we're going to take that from the menu table presumably. If so, is it going to have the data? Is it going to come through a relationship? So is it going to be menus related to, for example, the currently selected restaurant? As a result, do we need a restaurant relationship with that menu? So on and so forth. And by the way, you'll probably find you've already done that when we looked at relationships in your data structure earlier. But you want to think about, okay, where's that data coming from? Second of all, how am I going to filter it? What are some of the kind of conditional rules and criteria I'm going to put on that filter? You want to think about how that data is going to be sorted. So, is it the oldest data item first? Is it alphabetical? What is it? And then you also want to think about, is that data going to have any limits? Because, for example, you might want to paginate results. So, this idea that if you've got, say, more than 10 or more than 20, whatever number you specify on a page, then you've got to click next or click back. But it's really just up to you to figure out what does that look like. And so once you kind of complete this exercise and sort of think about them, and you're probably going to have, I'd be surprised if you've got more than a couple of really important repeating data lists. You don't need absolutely everything, as we say. Just what are the kind of key ones. Like if you're building Twitter, that's a pretty major repeating data list you've got there in terms of the timeline. If you're building an e-commerce website or an e-commerce app, you're probably going to have a listings, different products, all that kind of thing. Again, that's a fairly important repeating data list. So think about them, just think about how you incorporate them. But I think the one thing that I would say on that is just, these are pretty abstract and pretty hard. Don't worry too much about getting it exactly right. If you're struggling with this, and I can see why you would, you can just leave it until you get in the app. It's just an example of something that I've heard a lot of kind of questions about. do repeating data lists fit in? Well, the answer is yes, you can do them in scenarios, but if you're struggling with this bit, just do it in the no-code tool when you actually come to build it, because it will make a lot more sense when you can visually see the data, play with it, and make it happen in real time. So, last thing I just want to talk about is tools, and hopefully you'll see in a second why I kind of left it to the end. At this point, if you've kind of followed along, done your canvas at the same time, at this point you've kind of got a full app idea ready to go, and there's a few things you can do with that. You can jump in and just start building and hacking away on that. You can bring that to our community if you need any help, bring it to our office hours if you need any advice, and we'll have a look at it and tell you what we think. But if you want to get started, then usually the key thing you've got to do at this point is find a tool. And I even left a slot for tools on the no-code canvas, because typically, depending on where you are around your learning journey, you might either already know a few no-code tools, you might have found one or two that you think are going to be the right fit, you might have discovered through your app canvas or your no-code canvas that actually you're not 100% sure what tools you need. Maybe you thought you were just building a mobile app, but now you need a web app, and you've got to go research that. So, it's kind of bringing out these different questions. And at this point, you're probably going to want to go and figure out, well, what tools do I need? I think there's a few things I just really wanted to say on it. Number one, there are a ton of tools out there. Usually more than one tool can achieve a result. If you're building a mobile app, for example, you're going to have Adalo as available, you're going to have Glide, you're going to have your V1. There's tons of different tools that you can use for each use case. Quite often you're going to have to build integrations, you're going to build APIs. So as much as you might think, okay, I'm going to build that in Bubble, I'm going to build that in Adalo, it's worth thinking about where other tools can help you. Do you need Zapier to connect to something, for example? Do you need a tool like Billflow, which kind of does a lot of the hand holding for you in terms of payments? There's a ton of different stuff we've got on the no-code website you should go and take a look at, because you might find that a lot of things that you're trying to build are already done for you, already available in a tool. And if you do see any tools that are interesting, note them down in your canvas, and you can come back to them later, to test them out and try them out. What I'm not going to do, though, is in this video anyway, is help you evaluate those tools. I do have a separate video on that to kind of, there's a ton of tools out there, as I've just said, so how do you pick them? I've got a video out there to help you do that. But it's worth just going through those extensive listings, thinking about it, making sure you pick the right platform. The reason we've dedicated another lesson on it is because it's such an important choice to make, really. But now that we kind of know that, let's just look at a few final tips, really. I'll just move my face out of the way there slightly. I can't really. So I think a few things to say. You might be at this point feeling very daunted by this. You might be struggling with it. You might be thinking, whoa, this app is huge, how am I ever going to do that? I think the main piece of advice I would say is the fact that you've got this in a blueprint already puts you well ahead of 80% of people. Most people are jumping straight into a tool. Most people don't have the fundamental knowledge that you've just gained over the last few pillars, and most people certainly don't have a brilliant plan on a page ready to go. So don't kind of get too overwhelmed by that. The idea of this canvas is just to give you something that you can follow, and usually the next step you want to take after you've watched this video, if you've already identified tools that you want, then you probably want to go and start looking at kind of specific intro tutorials. They might be called the basics of, intro of, we've got a lot of them, but they're going to take you through the tools that you might be thinking about. And what we do for each is kind of show almost how the pillars translate. So how do you work with the database in Adalo? How do you work with the workflows in Bubble? How do you work with the integrations in Zapier, whatever it might be? And that's just going to help you go, okay, I've got the plan, now let me learn about the actual tool, because that is a big second step. You've learned a lot of the theory, you've seen demos, etc. But there's a step, if you've learned the theory and you want to build an app, there's a step in the middle that says, okay, it's time to get to grips with the tool. So, that's a whole other section. Don't worry too much about that. But it is just really a rough guide. The blueprint, it's just an outline. You don't have to stick to it. If you're finding it's just not, if you can't get your mind around it in terms of you get this idea, you're thinking about it one way that's probably very differently from how I might think, I don't have a right or wrong way of thinking about it. Just take that idea, and if you can't get it in the blueprint, try writing it down another way. Maybe just try jumping into the tool, ask for some advice if you need it. Ultimately, despite all the warnings I've given you, it is okay to just jump in the tool and play around with it. That's the way some people learn. It's the way that some people, pick up tools. So feel free to just jump in, try it out. And if you're kind of halfway through your blueprint, struggling to get the rest, again, probably the best way to unblock yourself is just jump in, play with the tool, understand it, get to know it, etc. And on top of that, it is okay just to not start with a plan. It is okay to just, as I've said, the plan's going to help you, etc. But it's not going to be for everybody. It's okay just to dive straight in. I do that myself quite often. As much as I usually have a plan for most stuff that I do, one of the things I'll quite often do is jump into a tool. I'll kind of sketch out or build out something that's in my head, and then once I feel like I've got enough of a feel for it, I'll then go build my plan out and do it from there. So I think the sum up of this slide is just, if you're struggling, don't worry, go learn the tool, dive into the tool, take it from there. There are generally 4 or 5 different ways you can start on your no-code app, so don't worry too much about that. But, hopefully at this point you've got a blueprint. Feel free, as I've said, to jump onto the video, take a look through there of my example. And we'd love to see your blueprint on the community. If you want to come and share it with us, get any kind of feedback, critique, any thoughts or words of encouragement, share it in the community, bring it along to office hours, we'll take a look. And I must say, I'm looking forward to seeing what you've put together. So thank you very much, and we'll speak again soon.